Half a day and welcome to the University of Guam Press's Creative Conversation. We are so happy to have author, sorry, I think, are we live now? I can't tell. Okay, Dispensa too. It's really, there's a lot of windows open. Off a day again, and welcome to the University of Guam Press's Creative Conversation with author Makiia Lucier. Before we welcome our wonderful author today, I just wanted to say a little bit about the press and our creative conversations. The University of Guam Press advances regional scholarship, develops cultural literacy, and expands accessibility to knowledge about Micronesia by providing high-quality, peer-reviewed publishing services. That's a bit of a mouthful, but basically UOG Press is here to support writers who are writing about Guam and Micronesia in all genres, and we are really excited, especially to work with local writers to support the writing process. My name is Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero. I'm the Director of Publishing, and one of my favorite things to do is work with a community of writers that we call Menyetlan Iman Titigi, which literally translates into siblings who write together. And so the Menyetlan Iman Titigi Fellowship started almost 2 years ago and includes a variety of activities intended to support our Menyetlu throughout their writing process, including peer review writing workshops and presentations and discussions with acclaimed authors and artists from our community through this Creative Conversation series. The goal of Creative Conversations is to connect authors and artists and create a space for them to inspire and learn from each other. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our marketing communications coordinator, who also is the fellowship coordinator for Menyetlan Iman Titigi, Via Defant. Half a day and welcome, Via.
Hafaday, thank you, Lola, and Hafaday, everyone. I'm so excited to be introducing our guest for this creative conversation, Makiia Lucier. Makiia is the daughter of former Onsalon Middle School teacher Lawrence Johnson and Saipan-born Margarita or Maggie Johnson. She graduated from Simon Sanchez in '93 and has degrees in journalism and library science from the University of Oregon and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is the author of the newly published fantasy novel Year of the Reaper and The Isle of Blood and Stone. Her publications have appeared on many notable lists, including the Kids Indie Next, the American Booksellers Association's Best Books for Children, and the American Library Association's Best Fiction for Young Adults. She now lives in North Carolina and she'll be moving to Oregon in a bit. But her favorite spots on island are King's Restaurant and Hoffa Books, which is sadly no longer open. Sizos Masi Makiia for being here. Before we begin, I wanted to share a little about Year of the Reaper for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet. So I'll be reading a couple quick excerpts for the book review, which was published in the Pacific Daily News and written by Leilani Lucas, who is one of our awesome book reviewers. So in her review, Leilani writes, in her latest young adult novel, Year of the Reaper, author Makiia Lucier delivers a fantasy world that feels all too real. Lucier takes us to a medieval country known as Olivieres, which has been at war with its neighbor Brissa for over half a century. The origins of the war is not made known, but the beginning of the war is not as important as what happens next. Dun, dun, dun. In the midst of this war, a new terror has arisen, a plague that leaves church bells and burned bodies in its wake, and an alliance between Olivieres and Brissa with a royal marriage. Year the Reaper does not reinvent the wheel because it doesn't need to. The setting is familiar to anyone who has read a fantasy novel with a hero's journey and a surly, if lovable, protagonist. But Lucier does manage to deliver a breath of fresh air. The novel is unusual because it is strongly driven by character relationships and development. The world building is spectacular. It doesn't take much imagination in the years of COVID-19 to capture the repercussions of disease on society, but she still manages to immerse you wholly in it. So that was a wonderful review. Makiia, thank you again for being here. Would you like to open up with a few words or a reading maybe from your...
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I love chatting with family back home on Guam. I actually, about a year or two ago, before COVID, I spoke with a book club at Dedido Middle School. And I don't think it's called Dedido Middle School anymore. It's called something else. But that school was my old middle school. So it was so lovely to talk to students where I used to go to school, you know, as a 10-year-old. So, but I'm happy to read a little bit about Year of the Reaper. And I can chat a little bit about what it is if you like really fast. But Year of the Reaper is a historical fantasy for young adults. And it's about a young engineer, 19-year-old Cassia, who returns home after 3 years away, only to discover that home is not what he remembers. His castle has become a refuge for the royal family, and they have brought their enemies with them. So while this book is definitely historical fantasy, it's also a mystery. It's Kaz, page by page and chapter by chapter, trying to discover who is out to harm the royal family and those closest to them. So it's largely a mystery. But yeah, I'll read a little bit, if that's okay. So the epigraph at the very beginning, anyway, it says, "Heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned." And that is pretty much the theme for the whole story. But with the prologue right here, it's, "They rode for hours through the night and into the dawn, stopping for nothing, not even to rest the horses. They knew what hunted them, a threat that could neither be seen, nor heard, nor felt, until one turned around and there it was. Too late to run then. Plague was spread through the air, you see. Everyone knew this. Jihan struggled to stay awake on her horse. Weariness dragged her chin to her chest before she caught herself, jerking upright in the saddle. Bleary eyes took in the tall, stately cypress lining their route, and the sun rising above the mountains in the east. 10 guards rode before her, 10 in back. So few of them remained. The others had been left behind in towns and villages along the way. Her people, shed like snakeskin, dead like snakeskin." So, yeah, there you go.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for reading an excerpt from the book and yeah, just getting everybody excited about what you're doing, which is really incredible. And so I'd really love to just dive right into our conversation. And, you know, I'd like to introduce the writers who have joined us today, Esther Sablan, Kiana Brown, and Eddie Akfaji. They've all been writing within our community in various ways, whether it be through, you know, their studies at the University of Guam or as part of our Manyatlani Mensitiki Writers Fellowship. Kiana's been writing incredible reviews for the Pacific Daily News. And so I'm really excited about this group of writers. Thank you so much for joining us. And Via will go ahead and introduce our first writer.
Sure, thank you. So we'd like to begin the Q&A with Esther Sablan, who is a mother, engineer, veteran, and history fan living on Guam. So Esther, if you have any questions you'd like to kick us off with.
I would love to. So thanks so much for sharing your work with us and your time. It is very inspiring for me to meet a published author. You know, one of the biggest questions that I have is, how do you structure your story as you are getting ready to write a novel-length piece of work? Do you start with outlines, an idea, or do you just jump into it and see where the words take you?
So my stories always start with an idea. With the Year of the Reaper, for example. Well, actually, I'll go back a little bit. My first book was called A Death-Struck Year, and that story was pure historical fiction that took place during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. I kind of like plagues. So that story took place right at the beginning of the panic, where everything was, the emergency hospitals were popping up, everyone was panicking, it was chaos. And as I was writing that first story, I started to think, well, what comes afterwards? what happened to the survivors, to those who are left standing at the very end of the story? And that turned out to be the premise for this book. This is a book about the survivors of a plague, for a different plague, but I wanted to see what happened afterwards, what happens at the end of the story. And that is all I knew when I started this book. I don't outline. I just I have my notebook here, and every day I just write with a pencil and a notebook and a blank page, and I just see where the story takes me. And I hope that eventually it'll start to make sense. So later on, as the progress continues, I will put together an outline, but it changes. I mean, it's in Microsoft Word, and it's just cut and paste. It's like a puzzle, just trying to get the story, to make sense.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, especially in light of kind of what the world is going through now, right? Just trying to navigate a pandemic. I just want to kind of do a follow-up question to that. When the Spanish had actually first come to Guam, there was a 27-year, drawn out conflict and war, really. But really the majority of the death and the loss of that time was disease that had been brought to our islands. Did any of that history, did you find that kind of seeping into even this like fantasy realm?
I think everything about my childhood, about Guam, about how I was brought up, I think everything seeps into your story, whether you notice or not. For Year of the Reaper, it's kind of set in a version of medieval Spain. And I chose Spain because although I've never been to Spain, I grew up on Guam, and it was a country that was sort of kind of familiar to me, because I could still see it when I go home. I could still see the Spanish architecture, the language, the Catholic religion, things like that. So when I was building a world for Year of the Reaper, I chose Spain. How you grow up, what you love, what you see, your religion, everything gets poured into the book in one way or the other. So.
Awesome. So I'd like to introduce the next writer who will be asking a question. I'd like to introduce Kiana Brown, who is a Black Chamorro writer and reader from the village of Makiia. She also, like I mentioned earlier, has been writing book reviews. She has her master's in English and is just a wonderful writer herself. So Hafaday and welcome, Kiana.
Thank you, Lola, for that introduction, and thank you, Makiia, for being here and for following my Bookstagram account. I was so excited when I found out that there was a published writer from Guam, from Saipan, who is writing novels like fantasy, historical fantasy, which is like one of my favorite genres. And you kind of have already started, or you mentioned earlier, a little bit about what influenced you to write Year of the Reaper, right? Like wanting to continue on that thread of what happens after something like the plague. And when you said that, you kind of just made me think about, you've been writing, you also wrote Isle of Blood and Stone. And I'm wondering if you feel like your books are connected, like when you're writing these different novels, do you feel that they're connected? The stories are connected to each other, the characters are connected to each other. Do you find those kinds of connections important, or do you try to have each one stand on its own?
So what I noticed that, and thank you so much, but what I noticed is that the connection these stories have to one another, the connection is through me. You will see, because writing a story takes so much time, it's such a pain in the butt. I mean, this one went through 9 drafts, so it's a hassle. And if you're going to dedicate that much of your time to writing the first draft, the 5th draft, the 9th draft, it has to be about things that fascinate you, things that you are genuinely interested in. Otherwise, and I'm speaking for myself, I will stop. I won't finish the book. I will just put it away. So when I was writing Isle of Blood and Stone, I was fascinated by medieval map makers, the Middle Ages, So things like that. And I built a story around that. It's historical fantasy around medieval map makers. But it was written by me. So when you read this, you will notice that it was written by someone who grew up on Guam. That is a map of Guam, but it's really the kingdom of, St. John del Mar. But any kid on Guam will recognize that map. And that for me is the great joy of writing fiction. You can make stuff up. Your editor will let you make stuff up. So the Sea of Magdalene, Maggie is my mom's name. The village of Esperanza was my grandma's name. So, and wait, hang on one sec. Marinus Road. Well, we have Marine Drive, so it was, when I'm building worlds, you can tell that was someone from Guam who wrote this story. So yeah, I didn't remember your original question. Sorry.
That was a great answer. And I love what you said about how, you're really in charge of your own world. I think, myself as a writer, sometimes I forget that. And I have these like preconceived rules that have kind of grown there from what I've read in other texts, but, really you're free to write what you want. So that's going to stick with me. So I'd love to introduce our next writer, Eddie, who is an active part of our Makiia Lucier and also a very prominent and well-spoken writer on Guahan. So Eddie, if you have any questions you'd like to share.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Via, for that introduction. I really appreciate Esther's question because it kind of leads into mine. So Esther kind of asked how one would start the writing process for a novel. And I kind of have, I'm curious as to how would one decide how to end a novel? Like, when have you decided when to put down the novel? Is this all the information that I want to include into this piece or project? And how does one go about setting it aside or even feeling regret after having published it?
So what I do is I write my first draft, and my first draft is always a piece of junk. It's a piece of junk, and it's a skinny piece of junk. My first drafts are really thick pamphlets, maybe 49,000 words for the first draft of this, and I'll write it, and I finish that first draft. I know it's done, but I'm just sick of it. I'm just sick of it. So I just say the end, and I put it aside, and then after a while, I'll come back and reread it, and I'll realize it's not as awful as I remember. And I can start thinking about, there are parts of this book that I can fix. And so it's just a matter of building and building and building. And the end comes when you're sick of it again, when you put it aside. And it's just a process. But you know what? The difference between this one is that I wrote it first, then I sold it. So it was just me in my little bubble. This was sold first, then I wrote it. So the dynamics change a little bit. You finish the book because you're on a deadline. Your editor says, "Where's the book?" So you have to just have a little bit more discipline and less time for daydreaming. It's kind of a bummer.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that. And then I had another question, if you don't mind, after
Sure,
that.
no, not at all.
So, I know that writing sometimes, especially when you're on a deadline and, you're working with a publisher in that way, can sometimes be very isolating, right? And it's a big task. Do you have a writing community or trusted readers that help you through the process? And can you describe what that's like if you do?
I do not. I am a giant antisocial hermit. No one reads my stories. For my first book, A Death Struck Year, no one knew I was writing that story except my husband. And the reason no one knew, because I've never published a book before. I've never finished a book before. I didn't know any other Guam writers. So most likely I was going to fail. This book was never going to be published. And if I was going to fail, I wanted to fail as quietly as possible without anyone knowing. And so that things are different now. People know you published a book. You're writing on deadline, but I'm still a hermit. No one reads my books except my agent, my husband sometimes, and then my editor. And I think that's just me. Some people thrive with the writing community. They love the interaction. They love the feedback. No, my book is my book. My book is my book until it's no longer my book. And then it's everyone else's book. So I'm sorry. Does it just sound
No,
mean and
that's
antisocial?
awesome.
Okay.
No, and I think that what you illustrate is, that like writing is something very sacred to people, and it's a different process for everybody, right? There's no
Absolutely.
right or wrong way. And I think what I'm hearing from you that I think is really important is that it's important to embark on something even with the fear of failure hanging over you, because if you can push through that, like you said, maybe that first book didn't go where it needed to go, but the process of starting it got you where you needed to go, got you into that discipline, and look at where you've got, where you've gone since. So I think that's really inspirational and an important thing for us to think about as writers, right? Because you just got to stay on it no matter what that
You just
looks
gotta
like.
stay on it. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It is very isolating, I think, for most writers, because you're at home. You're home. There's no one sitting right next to you typing along, usually with you. So to be able to, you have to motivate yourself, and you have to love the story that you're telling, and know that you have to push through to the end. I mean, and you have to do it alone mostly. So yeah, it's a weird profession. Strange.
I think one thing that I really wanted to talk about in terms of the genre of fantasy was I had gone to, it was like an anniversary for Humanities Guam. This is like maybe 10 plus years ago. And Dr. Underwood had done like the keynote, and he had talked about how he was talking about how the humanities were so important because particularly fiction often brings us closer to the truth than like academic writing ever will, right? And like the value of fiction. And so I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about what are some of the truths that you want, or that came through, even if you hadn't intended them to, in this genre, and sort of like, what is this world you're creating a metaphor for?
So I did not start a story thinking I'm going to write on this theme. I'm going to write about this particular truth. I just can't. I just start to write, and I hope to tell an entertaining story. And then the themes, the thematic imagery is something that just kind of forms itself eventually, draft after draft. But I have to tell you that historical fiction has always been my first love. I love history. I love historical fiction. My first book was about the Spanish flu, was straight up historical fiction. 1918, Spanish flu, no fantasy. And because I knew the copy editors would ask, I documented all the facts in that story. It's set in Portland, Oregon in 1918, because I knew the copy editors would ask. So it's kind of like writing a thesis. I mean, it was just so fact-based because I wanted it to be accurate. With my second book, it's still based on history. The part about medieval map makers, that is from history. The part about medieval shipping, medieval travel, that is all from the history books. But I thought, because I could, I wanted to throw sea dragons in there. I wanted to throw ghosts in the forest. I wanted to throw fantastical elements. So I did. And that's when I started on historical fantasy. It's a way to take the history I love and just go a little nuts with it. And so that's what I've been sticking with.
That's so cool. I love what you said about it kind of being like a thesis, because you were saying earlier that you have the freedom to create this world at your will and with your imagination, but I feel like maybe there still are a few rules you have to follow if you're especially talking about history. So I kind of wanted to go back and talk a little more about your writing process. You know, prior to working at Yoji Press, which is a publishing house, I was just, you know, my hobby was a writer and eventually with dreams to publish one day. But when I got into the field, I noticed that it's a lot different. You don't really see the background if you're not in the field, you know. And so there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of editing and consulting with, you know, the editor and what they think would be best or what you feel would be best. So I was wondering if your writing process changed after you published your first book, and if there was anything you learned from that publication process that helped you in your second book.
So what I noticed, I never planned on becoming a writer. No, well, okay, I shouldn't say that, because I have a journalism degree, but I thought I wanted to become a newspaper writer. But then I took a couple classes and I thought, I don't think that's me. So then I went to library grad school. I thought I wanted to become a librarian. All my life, I've loved stories. I love storytelling. So I was never the kid who was writing in her notebook, writing stories all the time, never. But I was always that kid who had my nose stuck in a book, always. I mean, just at middle school, I would spend it at the library. I was just a giant geek. So what happened with my first book was I had my library degree, and right after I got it, we moved to this teeny tiny town in Idaho that had no library jobs. There was nothing. I had a preschooler at home, and I was bored out of my face. So what I did is I picked up a notebook, it's cheap. I picked up a pencil, it's cheap, and I just started to write because it gave me something to do. And that turned out to be my first book. So yeah, what was your question? Sorry.
No, that was great. I was just wondering if your process has changed since you published your first book.
Okay, so my process for actually writing the book hasn't changed. Every morning, usually, my husband will go to work. My daughter, when she was here, she's in college now, would go to school. The house was quiet, and then I would start to write. Just write and write and write and write. And I would just do that until I had a book finished. And after my first book, it was a matter of, I kind of learned as I went along. I didn't know anything about literary agents. I didn't know anything about publishers. So it was just the writing and the research in the publishing world went hand in hand. So I found an agent in New York who I love, who is still my agent. And then we tried to sell a book, and everyone kept saying no. Historical fiction is hard to sell. Historical fiction, most people think it's kind of boring. It's not as sexy as fantasy. So Susie and I, my agent, did a bunch of rewrites, and we got close a couple of times. And then around Thanksgiving of whatever year that was, we got 2 offers from 2 different publishers. And one of them was Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which was just, and I was thinking, I'm just this kid from Guam. We don't get publishing offers from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Is on like every spine on every book. And so it's just so weird. And it's just at these times that I wish my dad was alive, because my dad loves stories and he never, lived enough to see me publish the first one. So it was just, anyway, yeah, it's been a journey. But the actual mechanics of writing a story, it's always been pencil and notebook, 9 o'clock in the morning until you get the job done.
Awesome. So we're going to go through a second round of questions from our local writers, but I just had a quick question from our Dean of University Libraries who's tuning in, Dr. Monique Story. Happy Dr. Monique. She was asking, how much do literary agents support Pacific writers? And are there kind of an extension of that? Are there really good agencies that support Pacific writers? Yeah.
As far as I know, I am the only Pacific Islander. Actually, like Kiana, I'm half black. I'm half black, half Pacific Islander. So I'm but as far as I know, Susie and New Leaf Literary contrary, I don't know of any other Pacific Islanders. There are so few of us writing, and there are so few of us represented. I couldn't tell you really another agency who supports Pacific writers. I really don't know at all.
Wow,
I do
that's
know
okay.
every May is Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And it makes me nuts because you go on the internet and social media and they'll say, we have all these young adult Asian American writers. I wish we could find some Pacific Islander writers. There's just no one out there. And you're like, me. So yes, yeah, it feels like it's still a struggle to just be known as a Pacific Islander writer. There's just so few of us out there published.
Well, hopefully we can change that with the press. We've really been, focused on how do we help our writers go into the spaces that they want to go to. And so I'm really excited that, one of our most recent books, Properties of Perpetual Light by Julian Uggen, had garnered so much attention that an agency did pick him up and he was able to get a book contract. So, I think that the more that we continue to write and put ourselves out there and just be unafraid, it's gonna make a difference, and you'll be hopefully in company with more Chamorro writers in a very, I understand the industry has a long way to go, but your existence gives so many people inspiration, and I hope that changes soon. So okay, we'll go ahead and go back around to Esther.
Hello again. Wow, this is so interesting. Like I'm absolutely just loving hearing about your process and your inspiration. One thing that piqued my interest, you talked about having written the case where you wrote the book first, then sold it, and then the second case where you sold the book first, then had to write to a deadline. In that second case, did your agent or your editor give you any framework to stick within? Was it a word limit? Was it a type of genre or direction? What were you? What was your objective, if any, that was given to you by them?
Sure. So in your contract, it'll state you're going to write this book. It's going to be for this age audience. It's going to have approximately this number of words. For YA, it's kind of a minimum of 75,000. I think this is 95,000 or so, 83,000 or so. So they give you a general guideline. So I sold this first, and I sold it, I think, on a paragraph. I think because I had a history with this publisher, because they knew that when I say I'm going to get something done by a certain time, oh, baby, they know, they trust me. I can meet those deadlines. So I sold this on a paragraph, just a quick paragraph, and then they gave me time to write it. And then you'll turn in your first draft, then they'll give you time to revise it and revise it. They won't pay you more money until you turn in the final draft. So there's an incentive to finish your story if you need the money. So, yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. I just have like a really quick follow-up question. How did you choose which paragraph, or how did you make it intriguing enough, in such a small space for them to be like, oh, this is something we want to invest in?
This idea was kind of something that I was just mulling ever since my first story. So it was a paragraph I've been working on for years. And what you do is you put together the paragraph, you send it to your agent. Your agent is she's not your best friend, but that lady is she has my back. And if something stinks, she will tell you it stinks. If she doesn't think something will sell, Susie's not shy. She'll tell you that. So I have a really good agent who is honest and who has just been a huge, huge help to my career.
Oh, great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I feel like also us as writers and, artists, we have that kind of territorial, feelings towards our writing, and we want to believe that it's, pretty good. So but I totally agree. It's necessary to have those second pair of eyes. So I'd like to go ahead and move it on to Kiana. Kiana, do you have any questions?
Yes, I'm going to bring this conversation back to a genre because when you were talking about like historical fantasy, and then I was thinking about navigating that line between history and fantasy, right? You talked about throwing in sea dragons and whatever you wanted. And then you also shared that you're into history and that, you know, that kind of is where you started. But I am such a fan of fantasy, and I'm so interested on the fantasy side, you know, who your influences were, if any, because fantasy is such a huge genre and there's so many different directions, so many different like cultural influences, cultural myths that can make its way in there. And so I'm wondering like, yeah, where you began with like your fantasy ideas and how they worked their way into your stories.
So I don't only read fantasy. I don't only read history. I remember when I was a kid, I mentioned this earlier, the kid with her face in a book, that kind of kid. And I never just read one particular genre. I remember reading Anne of Green Gables. I remember reading my dad's age inappropriate Louis L'Amour's, those raunchy Westerns. When I was 10, I remember reading Stephen King's It when I was 11 and giving myself nightmares. I remember just reading all kinds of stories and not loving any story in particular. I just love stories. And I also love fantasy. And when I'm looking at fantasy, I do tend to gravitate toward the authors who write both by history and fantasy. I love Naomi Novik. Naomi Novik writes a series that starts with His Majesty's Dragon, and that is about Napoleon's war with England, but with dragons as part of the Air Force. So I love how she took an actual proper war and she threw dragons in it, you know, as the Air Force. It was amazing. I love Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier, and she writes about, yeah, so her writing is what, medieval, ancient Irish fantasy or something? It's just an amazing mix of history and fantasy. I love this author so much. And she blurbed my book. I almost fainted when she blurbed my book. So I love, if you're talking about straight up fantasy, this is a reread for me. It's called The Cloud Rose by Martha Wells. Love this book. There's no history in this. It's about these great flying lizard races. It's amazing. It's just the most amazing thing. So I don't think it's just fantasy. It's just the story. If it's a good story, I'll love it. So maybe somewhere down the road, I'll write straight history again, or some other genre I haven't touched on yet. But for now, I'm pretty obsessed with historical fantasy.
How cool. Congratulations on that blurb. It must have been such a dream. Awesome. And thank you for sharing, you know, the variety that you read. Yes,
Sure.
This is Matlack. He wanted to listen in too.
Hello, it's nice to meet you.
He's shy.
So
Next up, we have Eddie, Haffaday Eddie.
Today, oh goodness, I am wondering I'm like writing notes on the side. I'm fighting the urge to write notes because I'm forgetting this is recorded. Like I'm writing so many notes. I'm like saying, I'm so inspired to write right now. I guess I would ask, so you said that between the two books you had, you first wrote the book and then you sold it. And then for You're the Reaper, you sold it and then you wrote it. Between those two processes, I was wondering, which would you like recommend, and if you could like go into the pros and cons of that process of between the two?
well, I think when you first start out, Eddie, I think most people have to write the book and then sell it, because no one knows who you are. They don't know if you can finish the book. So many people can start a story, very few can finish it. I remember writing a draft or two of my first book and sending it to a bunch of agents, all who said no, except for one, and that was Susie. But Susie didn't say yes right away. She said, hey, this book has potential. It's not there yet, but if you are willing to read my notes and rewrite the book, I'm happy to take another look at it. So what Susie wanted to do was to see if I could fix the book, but also to see how I took criticism, because some people cannot take it. Some people lose their minds. They cannot take someone criticizing a work that is so close to their heart. So she was testing me. So since she was my only option, I rewrote the book, gave it to her, and she said yes. So I think as a first-time writer, you have no choice. You have to write the book first. But this isn't all sunshine. To sell a book and then write it, a deadline. And you can't walk away because they gave you money. If you walk away, you have to give back the money. It's all hard. With this, or actually with my current book, which I can't really talk about in detail, I sold it first and then I'm writing it. But I'm writing a book in the middle of plague. My concentration is a bit shot lately. I'm writing a book when I'm moving my family across the country. Yeah. So there's just, they all have their challenges. It's just, you just need to finish the work.
Thank you for sharing that, Makiia. Even working in a publishing house, I still find myself learning so much from hearing other people's experiences and, what they learn and what they take away from it. So I feel like, we can all agree that this conversation was very insightful and also very inspiring. Eddie, I'm so glad that you said that you felt inspired to write, because I feel the same way. So thank you again for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. And I hope that, like I said, others are inspired by what you're doing and really listening to your experience, because it's so important. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, and navigating all that criticism and the process can seem like a lot, but I think what you've shown is that it's worth it. And we are all so happy that you're giving voice and space to Chamorro writers, and just keep it up. We hope that we stay in touch with you. We're going to continue to follow your career, and just anything you need, please reach out. And then, for those watching today, if you're interested in creative writing workshops and participating in conversations like this one, please contact us at uogpress@triton.uog.edu, or through any of our social media pages. You can find us by looking for UOG Press. We're always open to having new writers. We have 3 active creative writing peer review workshop groups going. So, please don't be shy. Please reach back out to us, and please don't stop writing, whether you do it alone or in company. Thank you again, Makiia, Kiana, Esther, and Eddie. And we look forward to seeing everybody at our next creative conversation. Happy Saturday. Adios.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having